I vividly remember this one moment from my time in high school. A politician from the Christian Democratic Union, one of the largest parties in Germany, visited our school to meet with the top students. And he asked us about our plans, as there was a scholarship available for the highest achievers. And I remember him going through the room and asking each person about their ultimate life goal. And when it was my turn, I simply said, I want to be happy, and I want to do whatever it is that makes me happy. And I know that might sound a bit cheesy, but I meant every single word of it. But instead of reacting normally, this guy grinned and laughed at me as though I was this strange little naive child who didn't understand the real world. He then asked me what I really wanted to do, because happiness, that obviously couldn't be the ultimate goal. And when I pushed back, he grew visibly annoyed. At that time, I found this reaction merely a bit annoying, but looking back, I think this reveals something much deeper. We live in a world where happiness has become an embarrassing answer, where the language of productivity, efficiency, and self-optimization has so thoroughly colonized our inner lives that a teenager saying, I want to be happy, sounds naive rather than reasonable. And all of that while Aristotle proposed eudaimonia, so human flourishing and happiness, as the telos, the ultimate goal of life. So how did that very same thought come to be perceived as childish and naive? To really understand what's happening here, we need to look at the philosophical and psychological roots of that problem. And those roots go deeper than you might expect. So today we'll go from the Enlightenment to fascism to the one-dimensional man. And I promise every single one of these connections will make sense. But before we start, a small introduction. I'm Tim, a psychology student from Germany. I write articles on the intersection of psychology and philosophy on my Substack. If you want to check that out or that interests you in any way, you can take a look at the description. And something I also always like to say before my videos is that I'm not an expert, so take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. And if these topics interest you, then you can simply take a look again in the description, because all the references are there. There's one philosopher who would have viewed all of this with a very critical eye. His name is Theodor Adorno. Like Sartre, Adorno was a short, slightly stocky professor with horn-rimmed glasses and a leading figure in left-leaning student movements. Much like Sartre, he too had numerous affairs with attractive women, and his lectures were consistently packed with students eager to hear his thoughts. One might actually wonder how much of these students grasped what he was saying, because he was simply not known for choosing the easiest formulations. When I first read one of his central works, I didn't really understand a word either. But I think actually you can distill down the central premise to one thought. And that thought being that modern capitalist society has lost its way. Despite breakthroughs in medicine and even in some areas equality, technology and so on, we are adrift. We no longer know what it makes life worth living. And ultimately, we have forgotten what it means to love or to be truly happy. That is why he writes, every person today, without exception, feels insufficiently loved, because each is incapable of loving enough. So how did we reach that point? In their collaborative work, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and the sociologist Max Horkheimer set out to answer that exact question. And they start at the Enlightenment. First, Adorno and Horkheimer begin by acknowledging the significant progress brought to humanity by the Enlightenment. Obviously, thinkers like Rousseau, Voltaire, Kant, but also many others, they made real progress, and they played a vital role in questioning the clergy, superstition, and brought rational inquiry. Obviously, that isn't something that wasn't available before, but in the Enlightenment, this progress happened really fast. After all, one of the themes of the Enlightenment was the very liberating question, who should rule over the people, if not the people themselves? And that was a really liberating question. Real progress, without question. Yet, Adorno and Horkheimer identified a crucial paradox buried within this very logic. Because in the new dawn of Enlightenment, humanity, as we began to harness nature through rational thought, paid a bitter and unexpected price. the same drive to understand and control the natural world gradually turned inward, until nothing, including humans, were exempt from its logic. They write, ever since its inception, enlightenment in the broadest sense of progressive thought has pursued the goal of dispelling fear from human beings and installing them as masters. Yet the fully enlightened earth radiates under the sign of triumphant calamity. So what does that mean in practice? Adorno's argument is that the Enlightenment's great project, freeing us from irrational fear, superstition, from terror of nature, and understanding it, inadvertently produced a new kind of unfreedom. By rationalizing and instrumentalizing every aspect of existence, we estranged ourselves not only from the natural world around us, but from our own inner lives. We became victims to the very system that we built to liberate us. In this view, truth is no longer freely knowable. Instead, we live within a kind of self-administered deception, where the drive to measure, control, and utilize every aspect of the natural world, including ourselves, made genuine reflection impossible. This may remind you of the allegory of the cave used by Plato more than 2,500 years ago, and he talks about how people look at shadows cast onto the wall of a cave and mistake them for reality. Adorno makes a central similar point because to him, humans now watch everything through this lens of utility and function. However, Adorno pushes this idea even further because to Adorno, as we fall victim to this very same logic of utility and rational goals, we cannot look at the world around us. So in some sense, there is no philosopher king who has seen the sunlight, as in Plato's allegory. As he wrote, there's no longer any vantage point outside the gearbox from which the haunting could be named. So what Adorno is saying is that even if we realize somehow that we are living the wrong life, he famously concludes that there is no such thing as the right life in the wrong one. You cannot live well within a fundamentally distorted world simply by trying harder, because this problem, it is structural, not personal. At this point, you might reasonably ask, isn't that all, a little dramatic? The Enlightenment, sure, has led us to this kind of rational thought, but how in the hell is it connected in any way to fascism? That is what Adorno and Horkheimer too try to find out now. First, it is worth pausing here and acknowledging that this is very much contested territory. And of course, Adorno and Horkheimer too wouldn't say that fascism and Nazism of the 20th century is a pure result of the Enlightenment. Obviously, there were different reasons, like the humiliation of Versailles, the hyperinflation, and the collapse of the Weimar democracy, and so on. But they want to search for deeper, more psychological and philosophical reasons. How could this have happened? To understand this, it helps to remember that both Adorno and Horkheimer lived through the Holocaust before fleeing to the United States. Both of them had a Jewish background. And upon returning to the devastated Germany after the war, Adorno was haunted by two questions. How could this have happened after centuries of Enlightenment and humanism, which was brought to by the Enlightenment, and what would it take to prevent it from happening again? A series of studies published by Adorno under the title Studies of Authoritarian Personality yielded some very interesting results indeed, because he found that at least 2/3 of Germans were still skeptical about democracy, even following the Nazi era, and half of them rejected any shared responsibility for actions in the regime. So there seems to be, at least according to Adorno, some deeper background to this problem. Why did this happen? I mean, it couldn't be just Hitler if these results show that it is very much a cultural problem here. And his explanation runs as follows. As we have already learned, the instrumental rationality at the heart of Enlightenment, the drive to understand and control the world around us, doesn't stop at nature. It turns eventually towards human beings. And when it does, it produces a kind of thinking that evaluates everything, including people, purely in terms of utility. He writes, the Enlightenment relates to things as the dictator relates to people, recognizing them insofar as he can manipulate them. The man of science knows things insofar as he can control them. This tendency is ultimately what led to the rise of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. This is what Adorno and Horkheimer posit, at least. Of course, it would be wrong to analyze this tendency as something inherent in science and rational thought itself. Rather, his argument is about what happens when scientific logic is misapplied and overreaches, when the very same logic of rational thought is misused. For example, Adorno wouldn't criticize the evolutionary theory by Darwin for its accuracy and importance, but there's a very crucial overreaching of that very same logic with social Darwinism, which wasn't scientific anymore, but built onto that very same logic. For example, Herbert Spencer, who coined the phrase survival of the fittest, took Darwin's biological observations and applied them directly to human societies. He argued that there was this natural hierarchy among races and nations and that the dominant ones were morally superior. This is, of course, complete pseudoscience. First of all, there aren't any races. And second of all, there's obviously no hierarchy between races. Maybe I'll even make a video of that someday. But the crucial thing, and this is just an example of that logic, is that the scientific and rational inquiry overreaches. And under the banner of science and rational progress, these ideas now spread even better because eventually they could furnish the ideological scaffolding of the Nazi program and racial extermination in general, now under the banner of science. As Adorno writes, Enlightenment, with every step it takes, becomes more deeply entangled in mythology. So now that mass movements are no longer religious and built on mythologies, they become pseudoscientific and thus even more powerful. Because now they operate under this guise of science and rationality. This is a new form of scientific irrationality and mythology. It is not merely a regression into earlier barbarism, however, it is something much more disturbing, because now it is bureaucratically administered and pseudoscientifically justified. Here Adorno observes the inversion of central themes of the Enlightenment: egalitarianism, development, equality, and brotherhood. All of these reappear, but now in altered form. We find rationalism, but in a distorted sense. We find enforced conformity in racial science and the coordination of all members in the regime, as is normal with authoritarianism, and the new myth acquires a new quasi-religious necessity through the rationalized pseudoscience. In this sense, Adorno saw National Socialism as an extreme manifestation of the instrumental rationality found in the Enlightenment. So that very same logic that the Enlightenment found ended up bringing us to nationalism and National Socialism. This is also found in this bureaucratic rationalization, when individuals are not treated as qualitatively distinct as people, but as units, as part of the system. And obviously, when you see people like this, you can much easier commit these atrocities that happened in the 20th century, because people are no longer people, they are numbers in a system that you just need to get rid of. Therefore, Adorno and Horkheimer conclude, when rationality is stripped of ethical and critical reflection and science is reduced to mere utility, unthinkable atrocities become possible. They write, everything who seeks to break the compulsion of nature by breaking nature only falls more deeply under that compulsion. Such has been the cause of European civilization. Okay, so now we understand how Adorno and Horkheimer connect the Enlightenment to fascism somehow. But this argument doesn't stop with fascism. It reaches towards capitalism. For Adorno, capitalism has similarly naturalized itself through this kind of justification that egoism and competition, that is simply how humans work. It is this inevitable Darwinian struggle that we live in, because that is simply how we function. The market thus appears not as a historical construction, but as a natural fact. And then through the technologization of the world, we ourselves become rationalized components within it, similarly to a regime. Now people, as he writes, are inclined to regard technology as a thing in itself, as an end in itself, as a force with a being of its own, and thus to forget that it is the extension of human beings. Hence, technology becomes fetishized. Not only in the sense that everything is now technological and very modern, but in the sense that we ourselves become technological. We ourselves, in a sense, become this part of a system. We become tools. Adorno calls the result the administered world, a society in which every aspect of life is organized according to the logic of utility, efficiency, and measurable output, and in which this organization comes to feel not as an imposition, like in a totalitarian system, but just as the natural order of things. And he tries to make that even clearer with the next example. To illustrate this dynamic, Adorno and Horkheimer turn to one of the oldest texts in Western literature, Homer's Odyssey. Unlike other ancient heroes such as Hercules or Achilles, Odysseus' defining attributes aren't strength and bravery, but cunning and intelligence. In the Odyssey, he uses reason to maneuver himself through monsters, sirens, and the world of Greek mythology. For Adorno and Horkheimer, this makes Odysseus the first fully formed modern rational being, the modern bourgeois individual. And the reason for that is that Odysseus doesn't just use his intelligence and reason, he tries to control himself. For example, when he meets the enticing sirens, he binds himself to the ship, while his crewmates put wax in his ears. And in this sense, Odysseus overcomes the sirens by shackling himself. He suppresses his own drives to win the fight. Or consider how he escapes the Cyclops Polyphemus. He blinds the giant and then tells him that his name is nobody. So Odysseus escapes by erasing his own identity. Therefore, Adorno and Horkheimer conclude, in truth, the subject Odysseus denies his own identity. But his self-assertion, as in all civilization, is self-denial. To Adorno and Horkheimer, this is the exact representation of the fate of modern man. In order to function within this modern system, we need to suppress our own drives, our own needs, and our wish for a meaningful life, doing whatever it takes to conform to the system. Now we only have to build the last connection. What has all of this to do with self-optimization? We have all likely encountered claims like you must perform a dopamine detox, regulating your dopamine levels to prevent spikes caused by social media, or you need to avoid drinking coffee in the first 90 minutes, or you need to use the first 10 minutes of your day to get morning sunlight. Read only to learn, go to the gym early to manage your cortisol, look good, looks max, grind, optimize, repeat. Now the question is not whether self-improvement is good or bad. Being productive or exercising is not bad in itself, of course. I do it myself. The problem arises when these activities cease to be means and become ends in themselves. When we pursue them not out of, self-fulfillment or health, but primarily for external goals like money, status, or simply to conform to this cultural ideal. In that case, self-improvement no longer serves the individual begins to serve the logic of self-improvement. And this is exactly the dynamic Adorno described. The administered world does not require a dictator to enforce conformity. It produces individuals who administer themselves, who simply internalize the goal of the system, which is productivity and utility, and make them their own desires. This is like Odysseus binding himself to the mast, but now this is internally. In its more extreme forms, this logic becomes explicitly masochistic and almost like neurotic compulsion. For example, the looks-max and alpha male subculture, man inflicting suffering upon himself in this bizarre improvement camps where they try to pursue dominance hierarchies. This is just the grotesque endpoint of this very tendency that is far more widespread but in milder forms. So what looks like strength and self-mastery is, in Adorno's terms, a form of self-repression. And the fact that no one is forcing us to do this makes it even more insidious. We simply follow the ideals of the system because they become our own desires. The philosopher Herbert Marcuse, another member of the Frankfurt School, described this dynamic with particular clarity in his book, The One-Dimensional Man. And I want to bring him in here because he extends Adorno's arguments in a way that is directly illuminating for this self-optimization phenomenon. Marcuse argues that modern capitalist society produces a new kind of human being, someone who has been so thoroughly shaped by the system from birth through education, consumer culture, and mass media that they are no longer capable of imagining any alternative. When you are a child, think about it. What is the first thing that people are going to ask you? They ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the question obviously implies, what will you work as? What will you earn? And what will you consume? When somebody asks you to introduce yourself, if you have a job, the job title comes first. And this is exactly what I was alluding to with my introduction. This results in a person Marcuse calls one-dimensional. This is someone who has lost all his abilities or her abilities to criticize or reject the system, or to think outside the existing order. However, they do not feel suppressed because their desires are now shaped in advance, giving them the illusion of freedom. Here Marcuse distinguishes between true and false needs. False needs are those imposed by the social structures, consumer culture, and mass media. These needs bind each and every single one of us to production and consumption. This means the system's domination no longer appears as repression, but as comfort and efficiency. This is a new and even more stable form of totalitarianism, because now criticizing is no longer our own goal. So brain productivity and general optimization serve as a perfect example of this logic, because we internalize the goals of the system as our own. And it demonstrates how humans align themselves with the system of maximization, measurement, and utility. And this is also why this connection to fascism is not merely rhetorical. Classical totalitarianism requires a regime to administer its subjects. Now, in this modern self-administered world that Adorno and Marcuse described, it doesn't need any person at the top anymore, or a regime, because we are doing it ourselves. Of course, I just want to make that clear. I'm not saying that capitalism or our modern states are a totalitarian system in the vein of National Socialism, although there are, of course, these tendencies. I do not want to equate the two. But they share, in subtler and more mundane forms, the very same underlying logic. That is the point. The subjects administer themselves. The repression is now not imposed from outside, but it operates from within. And because it wears the face of freedom, I choose to optimize, I want to be productive, it is far more stable and far harder to resist. This may also ultimately explain why so many people feel miserable in today's self-improvement focused society, because they fail to recognize that this is their own self-oppression. They do not follow their own ideals, value, and a meaningful life. They follow the ideals of the system. And by trying to fight for themselves, they only succeed in increasing their solitude and self-oppression. Modern society has forgotten how to live a good life and what it truly means to find meaning. The roots of this forgetting run much deeper than modern productivity gurus. They stretch back to the Enlightenment. Although the Enlightenment promised us liberation from superstition and fear through the mastery of the world and the rationalization of everything, it ultimately estranged ourselves from each other. We have turned the world into a system of instruments, transforming ourselves into instruments within it. Reason was stripped of ethical reflection and reduced to pure utility. In this state, it becomes capable of anything. Adorno illustrates this through the example of National Socialism. While capitalism is not a totalitarian system in the vein of National Socialism, it possesses subtle and often unconscious totalitarian tendencies. Contemporary expression of this are found in the self-optimization and productivity bubbles. It is like Odysseus binding himself to the mast all over again, except this time no one is forcing us to do it. There are no sirens around. We are doing it ourselves. We do not optimize for our own happiness or for meaning, love. We are doing it for productivity itself. It is the system's goals rather than our own, creating what Marcuse calls a one-dimensional man. Maybe that is why the politician laughed at me when I said that I just want to be happy. In an administered world, happiness and the creation of one's own values are the only things for which the system has truly no use. Consequently, they are the most radical things a person can ever desire.